Hi, BookTube. Yes, finally, a non-fiction review, everybody. The political activist and writer Tariq Ali wrote an article in 2011 that appeared in the Guardian newspaper in which he said, quote, "The patchwork political landscape of the Arab world, the client monarchies, degenerated nationalist dictatorships, and the imperial petrol stations known as the Gulf states was the outcome of an intensive experience of Anglo-French colonialism." The book we're going to look at today draws on historical material which was not available to the public until this century. If you are already well read with regard to the British and French administration of the Middle East in the first half of the 20th century, this book should still contain some eyebrow-raising facts. If you know very little but you wish you knew more, I think you will find this book to be an accommodatingly written introduction to the people and places and dates. Though I would give one warning: get a good heating pad or book an appointment with a masseur, because you will find yourself shaking your head violently, gritting your teeth, or scowling or shouting. There is more dishonor than honor in this particular piece of history. The book we're going to look at today is A Line in the Sand by James Barr. That was published, the paperback edition, in 2011 by Simon & Schuster. Let me try and summarize this book. James Barr is giving his readers an insider's view, kind of letting them be a fly on the wall at key decision moments, and it also introduces the decision makers, starting from 1915, when the British government decided that it needed to make plans in case it was the victor in the Great War and had to divide up the spoils from the defeated Ottoman Empire. But they had to do this without upsetting France. France, their historic enemy, who were persuaded only by fear of Germany into signing the Entente Cordiale. The author actually calls that treaty a shotgun marriage. Now, once the Great War was over, both countries sent their administrative personnel into the region. That left them needing to work out strategies to outmaneuver each other politically, because they really did not want to work together. They had to combine those efforts with other strategies to keep peace with the different people living in the region, which included several different Islamic belief systems, some Christians, and a small Jewish population which had started to settle there in the early 19th century. All those people wanted independence, but not necessarily with each other. And in addition to that, of course, the colonizers were looking to exploit and protect the oil resources which had been recently discovered in what is now Iraq. There really never was a way to do all of that successfully. But both Britain and France spent 4 decades kidding themselves that they would manage it until they got so hopelessly tangled in all their contradictory decisions that they had no choice but to leave. The book ends in 1947 on the brink of greater turmoil, and with the United States stepping in where the colonial powers were stepping out. But Barr covers that subsequent history in another book. Let's say a little about the author, and it will be a little. James Barr, he's sensible about his online presence, and I think we'll need to wait until he chooses, if he chooses, to write a memoir, and that will fill out his life story. What we do know: he was born in 1976. He read modern history at Oxford. Details are sketchy. After that, on his own website, History That Matters, and I'll leave a link in the description box for that, he says he's worked in politics, which could mean a lot of things, for the Daily Telegraph, for the British Embassy in Paris. His first published book was a biography of T.E. Lawrence that came out from Bloomsbury. A Line in the Sand was the first of a 2-part series, as I mentioned before. The second part is Lords of the Desert. They came out in 2011 and 2018, respectively. And there was supposed to be a new work out last year. Yeah, a much vaster book covering 3,000 years of history of conflict in the Middle East. I wasn't able to find out if that publication date has now been rescheduled. Regarding structure, the Kindle edition of A Line in the Sand has 631 pages. 444 of those are text. That text has 29 chapters. They average about 15 pages each. The chapters are grouped into 4 sections. So here we go. Section 1, First World War. Section 2, Interwar period. Section 3, Second World War, and then finally the fourth section takes you up to May 1947, when direct colonial rule ceased. And I'm using those words carefully because colonial influence certainly carried on. But I can see why James Barr felt that was the appropriate place to close the book, when both the British and the French had withdrawn all their administrative personnel from the ground level in those countries. Now, there are also 84 pages of notes, 27 pages of bibliography, and a 48-page subject index. Also, 24 black and white photographs. I want to describe James Barr's writing. Also, it was rare for me to have to reread a sentence. Academic writing, sometimes you can get lost in prepositional clauses or just unusual vocabulary. There were a lot of people to meet, something the author couldn't really control. I would say that his style, it had a high school textbook-like straightforwardness, but now and again you got some touches of human warmth. And you'll see that in this quote that I'm going to read from page 248 about Charles de Gaulle. As a child, de Gaulle had dreamed of commanding an army of 200,000 men, and late in the summer of 1940 he set out to turn that ambition into reality. The auspices looked good. The highly regarded black governor of Chad had announced his support for de Gaulle, precipitating similar declarations in the French Congo and Gabon. De Gaulle grew overconfident. Ahead of an expedition to Dakar on the West African coast, he was seen buying a tropical uniform in a London department store, one of a number of breaches of security that were identified after the exploit turned into a fiasco. Although, when this happened, he briefly thought of blowing his brains out, he did not lose the confidence of the British. Bouncing swiftly back, he turned his attention to Syria once more. If he could win over the L'Armée du Levant, he would become a serious force whom the British could not ignore. Let's talk about how I got this book, how much it cost. I bought the Kindle edition on the 8th of June last year. I was probably browsing my Kindle deals. I don't do that so much now that I'm doing Read What You Own, or I don't look at my Book Above emails like everybody does. But one of those let me know that the book was on special offer at £2.99. That's $3.77 US. I did not know then how useful it would become, which leads me nicely on to the question of why did I choose to read this book? Bit of background, when I was in my teens, my father was reading all those big historical novels by Leon Uris. I was drawn to Exodus because I knew about the 1960 film starring Paul Newman. I didn't watch it because, as you all know, if it's an important film, I seem not to watch it. But the theme score had won an Academy Award, and I did know about the music. I don't remember much about that Leon Uris novel now, except the impression that the State of Israel came into existence by fighting the British, fighting the French, fighting the Americans, fighting the people already living in Palestine and in Lebanon and in Syria, etc., etc. Okay, so where am I going with all this? I chose to read James Barr's book as a kind of coping strategy. Last October, when Hamas launched their attack on Israel and Israel retaliated, my response to watching it on the news was despair and exasperation. The exasperation of there being yet more fighting, the exasperation of helplessness, but also some exasperation about being ignorant. The frustrating problem with current events is that the average person can never know, not at the time, all that is actually going on, all the factors which are motivating political and military decisions. It's not until much later, decades later, when confidential files are finally open for study, that the fullest picture of what is going on right now in the Middle East can be understood. And even then, I expect there will probably remain some mysteries. Reading James Barr hasn't brought me to some great solution or anything like that. It has eased my exasperation a little bit, just to know that the whole of the modern Middle East is a colonial construct. The motives for the decisions that were made, they were not good ones, so there's absolutely no way they could work out over the long term. Have I encountered anything unexpected or interesting about the book? I wasn't surprised by the British feeling of entitlement to the Middle East on the basis that Britain at the height of empire pretty much felt entitled to anything that it could make money from. So of course it wanted the Suez Canal and everybody's oil. I think I found the French sense of entitlement a little trickier to grasp, only because it seemed slightly less materialistic, and it had this pseudo-spiritual or nostalgic cast to it, which rested on ideas of France that even during the First World War were already more than a century out of date. They were Napoleonic or more bizarre, they dated back to the Crusades. There was an undisguised greediness in Britain's ambitions, but France seemed to dress up their imperial desires in more romantic clothing, if you will. Now, that could be me picking up a bias from the author. I will see whether, if I read other books on the subject, do they confirm or correct that impression. Is there anything readers should be prepared for if they choose a line in the sand? Well, you will shout at this book. I'm pretty sure of it. You will be trying to shout at the people that you're reading about. Just take Mark Sykes as an example. He's the fellow who in 1915 took a pen and just drew some lines across the desert, and that made nation states that had never existed before. Yeah, so you'll want to shout at him, Clemenceau, T.E. Lawrence, Henri de Jouvenel, Edward Louis Spears, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, Lord Moynes, everyone on that list did whatever was most convenient for their nations at the time. And as a result, they shortchanged the future of the peoples of the Middle East. Now, by the way, one thing I did not do, but it would have been very useful, was to create a character list. I do this with novels like, take, for example, Charles Dickens' Bleak House, where there are so many characters. I draw up a spreadsheet and I make a database with a column for names, titles, significant dates, accomplishments, any other notes. I'm thinking that what I'll do is schedule a quick skim reread of James Barr's book and create that data, because I think it's going to come in handy for any follow-up reading. And another point, because James Barr is focused on colonial decisions, colonial decision makers, the actual occupants of the lands that Britain and France took over, they are upstaged. This would not be a good book if what you were wanting to understand better were the ethnic demographies, some details about cultures like the Druze or the Kurds or the Levantines or the Turkomans and how they got along before the colonial takeover or what decisions they made about interacting with the colonial administrations. You are told that there was enthusiasm for Arab independence, but not what that meant from group to group. It would have made a line in the sand really, really too long if he had tried to include that. If anyone has book recommendations about Arab culture or a political history of the Middle East in the 20th century from an Arab perspective, I would be really interested, so please feel free to leave a comment. Finally, any recommendations for related or follow-up reading? The person who watches television just happens to own a 1969 hardback edition of Exodus 1947 by David C. Holley. Now, this is actually a naval history, okay? So it's focused on the boat, the American boat, which was renamed and recommissioned to take Jewish refugees to Palestine. But 74 pages of that text do cover the ordeal itself. And also there are some interesting photographs on that, so I'll probably take a look at that. Now, I would like to read Ranulph Fiennes' biography of T.E. Lawrence, a.k.a. Lawrence of Arabia. I don't own that, but I could reserve it from our county library, so that may be how that happens. I also want to know more about the Ottoman Empire, and so I have wish-listed The Ottoman Endgame by Sean McMeekin, and also The Ottoman Empire, the Classical Age by the renowned historian Halil Inalcik. Oh, you know, when you finish a long book, it feels like you're coming up for air after a deep dive. I have tackled 3 long works of nonfiction in a row, and I feel like right now I need either A, something shorter, or B, something that isn't about history. So I'm going to catch up with a classic work about visual art, John Berger's A Way of Seeing, which was published to accompany a BBC television series of the same name that came out in the 1970s. The programs, they kind of remind me of Kenneth Clark's Civilization, and I mean, that's how I laid the groundwork for my understanding of European culture. And I have an excuse to watch television, which is going to shock somebody in our household. Anyway, I hope your February reading is going really well, and I'll see you again when I bring out my review at the weekend. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.